There is a name that does not appear in any standard history of cartography. It does not appear in the encyclopedias that catalogue the great mapmakers of the 18th and 19th centuries. It does not appear in the indexes of the major European geographical societies, not the Royal Geographical Society in London, not the Société de Géographie in Paris, not the Imperial Russian Geographical Society in St. Petersburg. It appears in one place only. A single inventory entry in a probate record filed in a municipal archive in a city most people have never thought to search. And it appears there because of what was destroyed. I want to be precise about how I found this. I was not looking for a conspiracy. I was not looking for hidden history. I was tracing the provenance of a series of anomalous maps that had surfaced in 3 separate estate auctions between 2009 and 2017. Maps that depicted territories using place names and political boundaries that did not correspond to any recognized historical period. The maps were not fakes. The paper composition, the ink oxidation, the binding style all dated consistently to the mid-19th century. But the geography they showed had no counterpart in the official cartographic record. The dealers who sold them described them as curiosities, cartographic anomalies, maps made in error or for unknown private purposes. And that explanation satisfied everyone except the people who looked at them long enough to notice the detail. Because maps made in error are usually wrong in simple ways, wrong distances, wrong coastlines, misplaced rivers, these maps were wrong in a different way. They were internally consistent. Every place name, every territorial boundary, every road and river corresponded to the same underlying reality. A reality that the official map record insists did not exist. That is what led me to the probate record. And that is what led me to the name. His name was Ferenc Aldrich Voss. Born 1791 in a region that was then contested between 3 empires, died 1849. He was, by the record's description, a cartographer and geographical surveyor of private employ. The probate inventory listed his professional materials as follows: survey instruments, 11 pieces, manuscript maps, 437 sheets, correspondence files, 2 cases, reference atlases, 22 volumes, and then beneath that a notation that most people filing such documents would write without thinking twice. The notation read, "Materials above transferred to executor, maps and correspondence, ordered for destruction per testamentary instruction." Per testamentary instruction. Voss ordered his own maps burned. He did not donate them to a geographical society. He did not leave them to a university. He did not sell them. He ordered them destroyed. And the executor complied. 437 sheets of manuscript cartography gone in the same year the man who made them died. I have spent considerable time trying to understand why a mapmaker would do that. The obvious answer is that he was protecting something. But protecting it from whom? And why in 1849 of all years is a question that opens into something much larger than one man's private instructions. And in the decades during which Voss was working, an enormous erasure was underway. Tartaria. If you have spent any time in the older cartographic archives, you know this word. If you have not, here is what the standard histories will tell you. Tartaria, sometimes spelled Tartary, was a vague term used by European cartographers to describe the largely unmapped interior of Asia. It appears on maps from the 16th century onward, sometimes as Grand Tartary, sometimes subdivided into Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Independent Tartary. It is, according to the standard histories, a placeholder, a name Europeans gave to regions they did not understand and had not yet surveyed. And by the mid-19th century, as those regions were systematically incorporated into the Russian Empire and the Chinese Qing dynasty, the name simply became unnecessary and fell from use. That is the explanation. It is clean and logical, and it accounts for the evidence in a way that requires no further questions, except that it does not actually account for the evidence. Because Tartaria was not treated on contemporary maps the way placeholders are treated. Placeholders are vague. They have shifting edges and inconsistent internal detail. Tartaria, on the maps wherein it appears most fully rendered, has cities. It has roads. It has internal political subdivisions with their own names. It has trade routes. It has, in certain maps from the late 18th century, architectural illustrations in the cartouches, showing buildings of a specific and consistent style, buildings with proportions that do not match the architectural vocabulary of the European mapmakers drawing them. Buildings that look, if you study them carefully, like they were drawn from observation rather than from imagination. Voss was working in this tradition. The 3 auction maps I trace back to him share the same cartouche style, the same architectural illustrations, the same internal place name vocabulary, and they extend the coverage of the Tartarian interior into regions that the official cartographic record of the same period either leaves blank or describes only in the most general terms. He was not guessing at those regions. The survey detail is too precise for guessing. He had been there, or he had access to sources who had been there, sources whose documentation he chose to destroy before anyone else could examine it. That choice, the destruction, is where the story becomes impossible to look away from. He was not protecting the maps, he was protecting himself, he was protecting his family, and possibly he was protecting the people still living in 1849 whose existence his maps documented. What the specific evidence shows in the case of Voss and the maps attributed to him is this. There was a cartographer working in the mid-19th century who documented territories in enough detail to constitute a primary geographic source. That cartographer made an explicit decision to destroy his primary documentation before he died. The timing of that decision coincides with a period of intense political pressure on anyone holding documentation that contradicted official imperial narratives. And the 3 surviving maps that appear to derive from his survey work depict a political and geographic reality that has no counterpart in the official record. That is what the evidence shows. It does not show an ancient advanced civilization. It does not show a global conspiracy stretching back centuries. It shows a mapmaker who knew something, documented it, and then systematically ensured that his documentation would not survive him. The question that follows from that is simple. What did he know? To answer that question, I had to go back further, not into the wilder speculation about Tartaria's true nature, but into the specific cartographic record of the regions Voss was documenting. Because there are other sources that were not destroyed, that point in the same direction his surviving maps point. The surveys conducted by the Russian Imperial Geographical Society in the 1830s and 1840s, the same decades when Voss was working, contained something that the published summaries of those surveys do not mention. The published summaries are available in any major research library. They are thorough, detailed, and geographically accurate by 19th century standards. But the original field reports, the ones filed by the surveying parties before the data was processed and published, tell a different story in certain passages. I am being deliberate with that phrase. A different story in certain passages, not a different story overall. The basic geographic data in the field reports matches the published summaries. But there are sections in several of the reports from the Central Asian surveys of the 1830s where the field surveyors describe encountering settlement structures and road systems that do not appear in the published summaries at all. Not misrepresented, absent. The field surveyors documented them. The editors who prepared the reports for publication removed them. The structures they described were stone. They were large. In one report, the lead surveyor used a phrase that I have read many times since I first encountered it, and each time it produces the same effect. He wrote, in a field note dated 1836, that the structures appeared to be of greater antiquity than the local population acknowledged, and of a scale suggesting occupants or purposes not consistent with the current inhabitants of the region. Occupants or purposes not consistent with the current inhabitants. He was a trained military surveyor writing a field report. He was not given to speculation. He was documenting what he saw. And what he saw did not fit the category his training had given him for understanding Central Asian settlements in the 1830s. That field report was filed. It was edited before publication. The sections describing the anomalous structures were removed. The report that appeared in the published survey record contains a notation in the margin of the original that I examined that reads simply, "Not relevant to geographic scope of survey." Someone decided that stone structures of unclear antiquity and unusual scale were not geographically relevant. That decision was made before the information was published. And the man who made that decision, the editor whose initials appear on that notation, was a senior official in the same imperial bureaucracy that was, at the same time, overseeing the remapping of the Tartarian interior into Russian administrative districts. This is the pattern that Voss would have been watching. He was a private cartographer working independently, which meant he was not subject to the same editorial control as the imperial survey teams. His maps could document what the imperial surveys were editing out. And that independence, that freedom to draw what he actually found, rather than what the official narrative required, is precisely what made his work dangerous in 1849. Consider the position he was in. He had spent decades building a cartographic record that diverged from the official record in specific documented ways, not in fantasy, not in speculation, in the precise technical language of survey cartography. Here is a road, here is a settlement, here are its dimensions and orientation. Here is what I observed when I passed through this region in this year, all of it documented to the standards of his profession. And the official record was consolidating around a narrative that his documentation contradicted. He was 58 years old in 1849. He had been watching the revolutions and their suppressions. He had been watching the remapping projects. He had been watching possibly colleagues and sources disappear into the administrative machinery of the reasserting empires. And he sat down at some point in his final year and wrote the instruction that would appear in the probate record, the maps and correspondence ordered for destruction per testamentary instruction. I want to stay with that decision for a moment because I think it is more complex than it first appears. Voss was not simply protecting himself. If he had been concerned only with his own safety, the simpler option would have been to destroy the maps while he was still alive, without leaving any documentary trace of their existence. Instead, he left the inventory. He left the probate record with its specific notation about what was destroyed. He left, in other words, a record of the destruction. That is not the behavior of someone trying to erase a history. That is the behavior of someone trying to preserve a signal, a message in a specific frequency, broadcast at a specific moment, intended for someone who would eventually know how to receive it. The inventory exists, the notation exists. The destruction is documented, the maps themselves are gone, but the fact of their existence and the fact that they were destroyed by instruction rather than accident or neglect is preserved in the public record of a municipal archive, available to anyone who knows to look. The 3 surviving maps that I connected to Voss through paper composition analysis and cartouche-style comparison did not come from the estate. They predate his death by between 8 and 20 years based on the same compositional analysis. They were already in circulation, already in other hands before Voss died. He could not order those destroyed because they were not his to destroy, and that changes the significance of what he did order destroyed. The 437 sheets he burned were not his only documentation. They were something else. The correspondence, the reference materials, the survey instruments, the interpretive framework, the notes and records that would have allowed someone to understand fully what the surviving maps showed. Without that framework, the 3 surviving maps are anomalies, curiosities, objects that dealers can sell at auction as cartographic oddities without anyone understanding their significance. With that framework, they would be evidence. Evidence of what, specifically, is the question I have been working towards since I first saw them. The place names on the surviving maps are not random. Several of them correspond to locations in Central Asia that appear on the late 18th century Tartarian maps in European atlases, the large-scale commercial productions from Amsterdam and London that depicted Tartaria in its fullest extent. But the correspondence is not exact. The Voss maps show those locations with different names, or with the same names, rendered in a transliteration that suggests a different source language. and the road networks connecting them are more detailed than anything in the commercial atlases. More detailed and, in several cases, different. The Voss maps show connections between locations that the commercial atlases do not show as connected. Infrastructure, in other words, that the standard European cartographic tradition either did not know about or chose not to document. What the Voss maps suggest, if my attribution of them is correct, is that the remapping of the Tartarian interior in the 19th century was not simply the replacement of a vague placeholder name with more precise imperial administrative designations. It was the substitution of one geographic narrative for another. The old narrative, the one that the commercial atlases of the 18th century had depicted with increasing detail and specificity, showed a territory with internal structure, with cities and roads and political subdivisions. The new narrative, the one that the imperial surveys of the 19th century produced, showed that same territory as a frontier, a region to be incorporated, developed, civilized, a region without significant prior organization. The transition from one narrative to the other required the removal of documentation that supported the first. It required editors making decisions about what was relevant to geographic scope. It required, at the level of individual surveyors and cartographers who had seen what the first narrative documented, a choice about what to preserve and what to destroy. Voss made one version of that choice. He preserved his maps in the hands of people who already had them. He destroyed the framework that would have made those maps fully interpretable, and he left a record of the destruction preserved in a probate archive for whoever eventually came looking. I have been asked, when I described this research, what I think Voss actually found, what the maps documented that made them worth destroying, and I find that question difficult to answer in the way the person asking usually wants it answered, because the honest answer is that I do not know. The maps show infrastructure. They show settlement patterns. They show a political organization of territory that the official record insists did not exist in the form depicted. What that infrastructure was for, who built it, when it was built, those questions the maps raise but do not answer. What I can say is that the scale is wrong by standard historical expectations. The settlements shown in the Voss maps are not small. The roads connecting them are not informal trade routes. The overall impression of the three surviving sheets, and I want to be careful here because I am interpreting visual evidence rather than documentary evidence, is of a functioning administrative geography, a system, not remnants of a system in operation at the time the maps were made, which would have been, if the paper dating is accurate, sometime in the 1820s and 1830s. A functioning administrative geography in the Central Asian interior in the 1820s and 1830s that does not appear in the official records of any of the empires then claiming jurisdiction over that territory. That is what Voss documented. That is what the imperial survey editors removed from their field reports. That is what the remapping projects of the mid-19th century systematically replaced with a different story. And that is what Voss ordered burned in 1849, leaving only the signal of the destruction itself, the inventory entry, the probate notation, the record of what was taken from the record. But the field notes exist, the probate record exists, the maps exist, the notations in the margins of the editorial copies exist. And Ferenc Oldrich Voss, who does not appear in any standard history of cartography, made a decision in the last year of his life that preserved a signal in a form designed to survive the destruction of everything else. He was a mapmaker. He understood that a map is not simply a document of geography. It is a claim about reality. It says this is what exists, this is where it is, this is how it connects. The maps he burned were claims about a reality that the emerging official narrative could not accommodate. The maps he could not burn, the ones already in other hands, are still making that claim. Still sitting in the cartographic record, still inconsistent with the standard account, still waiting for someone to take them seriously as evidence rather than dismiss them as curiosities. The archive does not forget. The probate record sits in its municipal file. The field reports sit in the Imperial Archive, complete with their editorial notations. The 3 maps moved through the auction market, attributed to unknown makers, described as anomalies. The last mapmaker who drew the old world understood that maps can be burned. He also understood that the fact of their burning cannot. He made sure of that himself. He left the record of what he destroyed. He signed it, he dated it, he filed it in the public record of the year he died. That is not the act of a man protecting a secret. That is the act of a man who knew the secret was already larger than any one person's documentation, and who wanted whoever came later to know that he had seen it, that it had been real, that he had drawn it, all 437 sheets of it, and that it had existed before the year it was taken from the record. The buildings he mapped are still there. Some of them, at least, if the field report descriptions are accurate, and if the editorial decisions that removed them from the published surveys were made for the reasons I believe they were made. They are there under different names now, or under no names, incorporated into a landscape that the official record has described without reference to what they actually are. Voss saw them, he drew them, he understood at the end what that meant, and he made sure we would know that he had.